Russian President Vladimir Putin has slammed allegations that Russia is planning to fight against Europe, calling it utter nonsense. Putin said it is meant solely to intimidate the European nations to make them pay more money, and this is a Western propaganda. To discuss this further, we have with us Glenn Deason, who's a professor of international relations at the University of Southeastern Norway, joining us from Oslo. Mr. Deason, always a pleasure speaking with you. Welcome to WION. What is Russia's plan? What does Russia want in Ukraine, and how far into Ukraine or towards Europe does Russia really want to go?
Well, I think it's important to view the crisis in Ukraine as a security competition in a very traditional sense. That is, NATO seeks to be the dominant security institution that is hegemon in Europe, which entails or demands converting Ukraine into an anti-Russian bulwark. Russia sees NATO expansion into Ukraine as an existential threat, so it will do whatever it takes to enhance its own security. And as a result, of course, Ukraine has been put in a situation where its survival as a state has been threatened, and also has these concerns. So I think if Russia cannot get a neutral Ukraine, as they've asked for a few decades now, then they would like at least to get a commitment by NATO to end its expansion. If this is not possible, I think Russia will just make sure that no strategic territory in Ukraine would end up in the hands of NATO. So I think Russia would go for the territory, everything between Kharkov and Odessa, which were these traditional Russian lands, and probably make a mess out of what remains, simply because they don't want to see a strong Ukraine being able to be used as a dagger against Russia. So for me, now it looks like the plan for Russia in the near future is to open a new front in Kharkov. But again, this is the difficult or dilemma, if you will, because without neutrality, Russia will take territory. But the more territory it takes, the more difficult it will be to have a peaceful settlement. That is a solution both sides can agree to.
Mr. Deason, I just want to take it from what you mentioned, that they don't want NATO so close to them. They don't want NATO to be getting that kind of positioning right at Russia's border. But if we look at some other states, Finland is a NATO member state, Estonia is a NATO member state, Latvia is a NATO member state, Lithuania is a NATO member state. Now, they're all bordering Russia in some way or the other. Most of them have longer border. Finland has a longer border than Ukraine. What changes if Ukraine also becomes a NATO member state? Because if NATO forces had to position themselves, they can do it in any of these other nations as well. So what is the concern when it comes to Ukraine?
Well, the concern is that the Ukraine will be used as a front line against Russia. That is, to use Ukrainians to fight Russia, because there's an internal dilemma or internal division within Ukraine. That is, a large part of the population in the West are very anti-Russian, in the East they're very pro-Russian. Now, if you're able to support the anti-Russian segment, you can create a natural bulwark against Russia. Now, what's different with Ukraine is, unlike Estonia, with I think 1.5 million people, Ukraine has north of 35 million. So it's a much more powerful proxy if you want to fight the Russians. You can't really do much with Estonia or Latvia or even Finland, for that sake.
All right. Now, when Putin says that this is, they're spreading this narrative of an impending Russian invasion into Europe, and an attack on Europe is just another way for the powerful Western nations to extract money from countries. Now, this is a quote-unquote, almost, I'm just kind of translating from what he mentioned in Russian. Can you elaborate on this? What is he kind of implying on? And you did mention security competition. I think if you can link that and how to interpret these lines by Russian president.
Well, I don't think. Well, this argument is always that Russia's preparing to attack Europe. There's no purpose behind this. And as he always, as he also said, I think it's probably he's correct that it's aimed to merely support Western public to continue funding the war. It's the same rhetoric as we had before. That is, we have to fight them over there, otherwise we have to fight them here. I think it's also important to maintain the narrative that this is not a security dilemma, that this is not competing for security, that both sides want to be secure. As Henry Kissinger argued once, if absolute security for one is absolute insecurity for the other, which is why the whole idea of NATO hegemony on the Russian border is so dangerous. But it's therefore important to maintain the narrative that this is primarily about territory, that Russia's not actually worried about NATO. But I would say that this idea of an attack on Europe is also a strange argument, because we've been told over and over again that Ukraine must become a part of NATO, as Russia would not dare to attack a NATO country. But we're also told that once Russia is done with Ukraine, it will move on to attack Europe and the NATO countries. So this is very contradictory. But of course, I don't doubt that Russia is preparing for the possibility of war with Europe and NATO, but this has to be seen in the context of the security dilemma. They see themselves as acting defensively, and as we've seen, the West, they trained the Ukrainian army, they supplied the weapons, ammunition, the intelligence, the war planning, even got involved in target selection and pulling the trigger. So Russia, to some extent, then have been very restrained in terms of not retaliating against NATO territory. So it just seems unlikely to me that this is a war which is about Russian expansion. I think the territory that Russia has taken has been a reaction to NATO expansion, as it could not achieve neutrality for Ukraine. So I think it's an attack. It's a way of framing the narrative and mobilizing support. So Putin is probably correct in this.
So when Putin says that this is nonsense, we don't want to attack Europe, we don't want to invade further, how far into Ukraine does Russia really want to go? And I know we've discussed this in the past as well, but just to kind of, if we can draw it down onto a map, or if we can kind of pin it down onto a map, these are the areas that they want to gain, and then that's the end of the war. Are there any such areas?
Yeah, I would say Odessa, because the way Russia sees it, when the NATO countries toppled the government in Ukraine in 2014, the main prize for the United States was Crimea, because the key objective for the US and UK, for that matter, is the same as it was in the Crimean War in the mid-19th century, which is to expel the Russians from the Black Sea and effectively make this into a NATO lake, much like they're talking about making the Baltics Sea a NATO lake. So, from this perspective, I think the Russians would seize what it considers to be strategic territory, which is, again, everything from Kharkov to Odessa, which would make Ukraine a landlocked country. It would give strategic territory to the Russians, denying it to NATO, and it would also make Ukraine much less appealing to the NATO countries, and that's what they're willing to fight for. So I think Odessa would be where they would want to stop. And also in these areas, they actually find people who are more sympathetic towards Russia, who do not like the government they've been living under for the past 10 years, since the coup of 2014. Now, if the Russians go into Western Ukraine, they can't find a single person there probably who wants to be a part of the Russian Federation. So it's impossible to hold. It has little purpose to hold. So I think they simply want to retake the traditional territory of which was Russian before it was transferred to the Soviet Union. To Soviet Ukraine, and that's probably where they would stop.
So Kiev is not on the radar. Odessa essentially gaining some kind of foothold on the port region, that is, and obviously so that they ensure that they maintain a share in the Black Sea. I think that is, as per you, that is what Russia is aiming to gain. And once they gain that and they maintain it and they call it their territory, as long as they get that, that should be the end of the war, at least from the Russian side?
Well, Kiev, I'm not sure about. I don't think they can. I don't think they will accept having the current government in Kiev, because it's seen as working as being too anti-Russian. That it's being positioned as a dagger against Russia. So I think that the main objective is still now, as they express more and more clearly, to have regime change. That is to remove the government which came into power as a result of the 2014 coup. The problem for Russia is, though, since the war, a lot of Ukrainians, for good reasons, have now developed a lot of animosity towards Russia. So if you have any democratic election now in Ukraine, they will probably end up with a very anti-Russian government anyways. So Russia, in this sense, have painted itself into a corner, which is one of the dangerous consequences of this war as well. That it's unclear what can be done now.
And definitely after the deadly attack on Moscow recently, and Russia has made it clear that they see US, UK and Ukraine behind that attack, regardless of the claims made by the Islamic State, Khorasan region, or what US is saying regarding the Islamic State's involvement. Russia has made it clear that they see Ukraine behind that attack. No proof has been given for it, but they've made that statement out there. That is definitely going to have an impact on the ongoing war and the onslaught of Ukraine as it still continues. That was Glenn Deason joining us, is the Professor of International Relations, joining us from Oslo. Thank you so much for your time, sir.
My pleasure, Sharon.